a few quick words on United for Peace and our mission. We are an organization with a mission to create respect and unity in our communities across all differences. And we are followers of peace leaders like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and we strongly believe in nonviolence. So we also teach and train people on nonviolence. We promote nonviolence, and we believe in building united communities. So we are a nonprofit, and we work at the grassroots in our communities, wherever any one of us is living. So with that, I think the topic today is very much aligned with our mission.
I have been studying terrorists for 20 years. I'm a psychologist, and I've traveled all around the world and chased terrorists that are still on the loose practicing terrorism. And I've also talked to lots of terrorists that are in prison and or up on terrorism charges. Sometimes I've been the psychologist that evaluates them. And I've talked to about 800 terrorists. And in the last last 5 years, I started studying ISIS very intensively and talked to 257 ISIS returnees, defectors, and prisoners. And recently, I started talking to far-right extremists. And in the past, I was on the legal case for an abortion clinic terrorist. So most of my research has been on jihadists, but I can tell you that there's a lot of similarities across groups, and I'm happy to talk about that. In recent years, I've made my interviews on video, and that allows me, if the person gives me permission, to cut what I call a counter-narrative video. And with the US State Department, because we wanted to combat what ISIS was doing on the internet. They were so good at recruiting on the internet. And one of the things that ISIS has been credited with is being really slick and having great propaganda. But I would really give that credit to the internet and to social media, because in the past, when terrorists did something like when the Chechen terrorists took over the hotel in Moscow, they honestly had to take a videotape over to Al Jazeera, and it was a videotape of themselves speaking about what their goals were and what their demands were, but it was transferred to journalists and to a TV station on a cassette, video cassette. And Al-Qaeda used to do the same. When they had a dispatch from bin Laden, they had to go through somebody. Or Basayev, the Chechen terrorist, he would talk to Radio Liberty, and that's how they would get their messages out. But at the time when ISIS was coming up, social media was so well developed that terrorist groups now, and far-right groups too, so across the board, anybody, all the terrorist groups know how to use the internet. And what they do is they dispatch their message directly. And we saw this with President Trump as well, bypassing journalists and using his Twitter account to put his news out, his true news instead of fake news, right? And but from the point of view of a terrorist group, when you put everything out on social media allows you to hone through really quickly and sift through and see who liked you, who retweeted you, who shared, who had any interaction with your propaganda. So you can send it out to billions, and you can hone in on a very small group quickly, and then you can start talking to them. And what we find now is that the internet is a really intimate medium. I mean, here you are, you see me sitting in my room, and you decided I wasn't down in my basement because I've got the fireplace with the stockings here. You know things about me, you can see, and I look genuine to you, and you're hearing me, and you maybe even feel like we're in the same room. Well, it's no different with terrorists. So nowadays we see people create intimate connections over the internet. But in all this interviewing of terrorists over the years, and in many different groups, I came up with 4 things that I would say are necessary and sufficient to create a terrorist. And I call this the lethal cocktail of terrorism. And you can go on our website. I'm the director of the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism. That's ICSVE. And I can put that in chat for you. But you can go on our website anytime. And if I talk too fast, you can find these papers on our website. So I'm going to put that in for you. And lethal cocktail of terrorism is there as well. But so when people ask me, what did you learn from these hundreds of interviews? I learned that there's 4 things. And the first of these 4 things that you need to make a terrorist is a group. There's very few people that get into terrorism all by themselves. We hear about lone wolves, but keep in mind, lone wolves are on the internet. They're reading terrorist ideology. They're watching what other terrorists do. Maybe they're copycat criminals. They're inspired by somebody. So they are responding to a group, even if they're not taking orders from a group. So the group functions to create a sense of belonging, to write an ideology, to decide who should be targeted, to speak about the grievances. So like what you were saying, it's Sadika, right? What you were saying before about that your group functions on nonviolent solutions. Well, terrorists are the opposite. They pull a group together based on grievances, and Al-Qaeda, for instance, was very good at that, at coming into a local area and saying, okay, these are your grievances. Or we see that with the far right now, or the KKK, coming in and saying, you know, white people have grievances and these immigrants are the problem. But coming in, identifying grievances, and then saying violence is the answer. So the group creates a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, targeting, and they weaponize people. It's the group usually that provides the bombs, provides the instructions for the bombs, provides the guns, and individuals all by themselves are really not well equipped to do that. So we've seen a few individuals become terrorists all by themselves. Ted Kaczynski, he's the Unabomber in the US. I don't know if you know about him, but he sent packages through the mail that exploded, and he was against the federal government. He operated all by himself, but he was a math PhD. He was Harvard educated. He was a university professor. So he's a smart guy that could figure out how to make a bomb by himself, and he's a smart guy that could come up with some kind of ideology. We also saw Richard Dorner. That's a LAPD policeman. He was trained by the military and trained by the police. And when he went rogue on the police, he decided that the LAPD was a discriminatory organization, and he used his sniper skills that he had already received from a different group. And he wrote an ideology, a manifesto, which was kind of crazy, but he wrote it himself. But that is the very rare and far between terrorists. But you do see lone wolves, and they are totally different. They're still resonating to a group. They're still reading on the internet or watching videos, motivated by what a group is telling them to do, and maybe even taking instructions, but acting on their own, but still with a group somewhere in the picture. So that's the first thing, the group. The second thing is that all groups create an ideology or a narrative, and they name a grievance, and they pull people together around a grievance. And then they start to say how you should respond to this grievance, and they usually say that it's so horrible. So for instance, abortion clinic terrorists in the States will say, babies are being killed, and there's 1 million abortions in the US, and how can you stand by and watch these unborn babies being killed? It's like the Germans that ignored the Holocaust, and later all of history blamed them. And you're just a bystander while murder is being committed. And so then they say, and they use scriptures from the Bible and say, you should stand outside of an abortion clinic with a gun. And when the abortion doctor comes out, who they call a murderer, you should gun him down. And that this is an act of defense. So terrorist groups almost always put their murderous and horrible crimes as acts of defense. So you're defending innocent, slaughtered, unborn babies, and you're defending the ones in the future that won't be slaughtered if you kill the abortion doctor or if you blow up the clinic or whatever you happen to do. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab all argue that Muslims are under attack. So, and they're very smart about it. They will, this happened way back with Afghanistan and Chechnya. They learned the power of using pictures and later video to show, look, these Muslims are being harmed. The West or whoever they're saying is responsible for the grievance, or this country or that country, this government or that government, it hates Muslims, hates Islam, wants to kill us. So we have to be on the defense and we have to fight back and we have to revenge for the losses that we've already had so that we don't continue to have losses. So you hear the same type of argument, like, right, defense, and again, using scriptures. And anytime a terrorist group pulls religion into it, that makes it so much easier for them. Because if all of you already believe certain religious tenets, and I come up with a terrorist ideology and I weave those tenets that you already believe into my ideology, I'll pull you into it a lot easier. And I'll justify murder and different crimes a lot easier if I can use scriptures that I know that you believe. So terrorist groups know how to do that. So let's see, and the far right does the same. Some on the far right in the US are Christian groups that say they have to defend white America. KKK says whites and blacks should not mix, and this is according to the Bible, according to them. And it goes on and on. So, so thus far we have the group and the ideology. Oh, and I should also say, most people won't kill unless they're trained to kill. And it's hard to train someone to kill. And it's especially hard to train someone to kill innocent, especially innocent women and children. So all of our militaries, when we train up people to be in the military, they've learned that a lot of people won't shoot. They get in combat and they won't shoot. Even if they're being shot at, they won't shoot. So they teach them, you're responsible for the guy on your right and the guy on your left. And they find that people will shoot for their brothers. But they, a lot of times, don't shoot for themselves because they don't want to kill. And so you have to overcome someone's instincts not to kill. And terrorist ideologies do that, again, by blaming for agreements and saying they're killing our civilians or they're killing innocents. So therefore, you have to stop them. And you have to stop them from doing this. But do you remember in Norway when the attack, or was it Sweden? Norway, Breivik. The guy that did that actually watched videos to try to train himself and desensitize himself so that he could kill women and children, because he knew he was taking an automatic rifle in and he was going to kill as many as he could. But he went through a mental process to train himself to do that. And that's what terrorist groups do as well. They create an ideology so that you can jump over moral barriers. So we have the group, we have the ideology. Then we have social support for terrorism. And whenever there's a high social support, so that's when a lot of people are sharing agreements. And you'll find this particularly in conflict zones. So let's say you go into Gaza or West Bank. People are facing blockades. They're facing a lot of checkpoints. They feel that they're under occupation and they feel that it's unjust. Maybe they're getting bombed. It's easy to recruit in those situations because the social support is up around 70–80% for terrorist groups. And if everybody agrees that it's a good thing, when we as people, we always look to other people to see, how are we doing? You know, am I dressed appropriately? Am I speaking correctly? You know, did I wear the right makeup today? Are my glasses the right fashion? All of us are always looking at everybody else for, what do I see in your face? Am I seeing approval or disapproval? Well, in Gaza, you can go to a protest and you might see a granny out in the protest with an RPG on her shoulder. So, you know, she's communicating, it's okay. It's okay to join armed conflict and use weapons and join these terrorist groups. And if your granny's saying it's okay, it's probably okay, right? And so depending on how much social support there is, we'll see more people going in. But the interesting thing about social support is, now with the internet, you don't have to look at your local community. So maybe you have a grievance, and maybe you even got your grievance because you started watching internet groups that are telling you something's happening in Palestine, something's happening in Chechnya, something's happening in this city in India, and it's so wrong. And you're just getting angrier and angrier, and you're watching things that are making you feel like this just can't possibly be correct, what's happening, and you're resonating to the victims. And then if you get into a group on the internet that's all telling you terrorism is the answer, you're in this high social support network that's telling you it's a good idea and reflecting back to you. If you join, you're a hero. If you martyr yourself, you're a hero. If you hurt other people that are doing this, you're a hero. If you hurt their civilians that are supporting the people that are doing this, you're a hero. So we have the group, we have ideology, we have social support, and then we have what's inside the individual. And what's inside the individual, there's at least 50 variables. And they break out by conflict zone and non-conflict zone. So if you're in a conflict zone, probably there's fighting going on because it's a conflict zone. There's people killed. So when I went off to Ramallah, one night we went to bed and our translator sat up in her bed. We were all sleeping in a common room. And our translator sat up in her bed and she said, I just want a gun. I just want to go and kill as many Israelis as possible. And I sat up in my bed and I said, are you saying you want to be a suicide terrorist? And she said, no, I don't want to explode myself. And I said, well, if you went and killed a bunch of Israelis, you would be killed. So it's suicide. You're talking about a suicide mission. And she just started crying and she said, did you see all the posters on my wall? Did you see all my friends that were killed in the blockade? And then I realized during the day, when it was dark when we were talking, there was a poster, there were at least 6 posters on her wall. And she said, those were all my best friends and they were killed by the Israelis. And she was so upset. So in her powerless rage, she was willing to align herself with a terrorist group. The terrorist group that she was aligned with didn't weaponize women, so she was out of luck. And I sure was glad about that. But if you're in a conflict zone, you can be angry about other people being killed. You can want to revenge. You can have PTSD really badly because of the things that you've seen, the things that you've experienced. And terrorist groups know how to use PTSD. If you're having flashbacks all the time, if you're in a high arousal state, feeling shaky, feeling upset, a terrorist group can say to you, if they use martyrdom missions, they can say, listen, we'll equip you to go and take revenge on these people. And everybody, when they contemplate suicide, has to find a psychological defense to jump over that barrier of killing yourself. And some people, when they contemplate killing themselves, if they're really, really serious about it, they can get an endorphin rush in their brain. So you're a pharmacist, you know about this. We have a pharmacy in our brain, right? You know, if you're out playing sports and you're on the sports field and you sprain your ankle and you decide, you know, it's too important, I'm going to keep playing. Your brain will supply you with something that's like morphine, endorphins, and you won't feel the pain until you're done with the match. And then you'll be like, wow, how did I play on that sprained ankle? And you know, you'll be a mess for the next month and your brain won't be supplying you chemicals anymore. But in an emergency, your brain does supply you with chemicals and hormones that can literally drug you. And what I found, I actually interviewed a woman in prison that was waiting for her suicide vest. She was waiting for 6 weeks. And as she waited, she got completely euphoric. And she described it to me, and the colleague that was with me said, no, I don't believe this. I don't believe somebody could psychologically endure waiting to go and explode themselves for 6 weeks. And she said, oh, no, it wasn't hard at all. And as she described it, she started getting high. So I asked her, she's Palestinian. I asked her, did you do drugs, or were you sleeping with your boyfriend during this time period? And she was very insulted. She's like, no, I've never done drugs. I've never drank any alcohol. Of course I wasn't sleeping with my boyfriend, no. And I said, well, as you're describing this, you're like you're drunk. And do you feel that? You sound drunk or high. And she said, yeah. And this is exactly what I felt for those 6 weeks. And I would sit in my house and I would look at my parents and say, goodbye, Mom, goodbye, Dad, and goodbye, brother. And she said, I imagined that I was already in paradise. And this sense of, she didn't use these exact words, I'm talking as a psychologist, this sense of euphoria was floating her away. And the euphoria was coming from probably endorphins in her brain. And because it's so horrific to imagine exploding yourself. Can you imagine? And this happens for many people that are preparing for suicide missions. And when I was in Belgium teaching, my husband's a diplomat, so we lived around the world. When I was in Belgium teaching, I got so fascinated by this that we did a thought experiment and we asked, I think it was 21 students, they were all different nationalities, all different religions. We asked them to come in and pretend that they were a Palestinian that had been stopped and was now in prison and was being interviewed about what it was like to prepare for a suicide mission. And all these students humored me and agreed to do it because I kind of had the reputation as the crazy psychology professor. But when they were in this role play, one by one, they went into euphoria as they imagined putting on a suicide vest. And some of them said, oh, I felt like I was walking above in the air, or I, was completely out of it, or I just had this wonderful, peaceful feeling, or I was filled with, they used the word euphoria. And none of them had been coached for this. So just imagining putting on a suicide vest kicked that in for some of them, not all of them. So what we have to understand is that in conflict zones, people are in terrible pain. They're really angry. They maybe want revenge. They don't like that family members have been raped, murdered, tortured. They want to stop the other side. PTSD is usually pretty high in conflict zones. And terrorist groups that are delivering an answer and saying, I have an answer for you. I can help you make the enemy feel the same pain you're feeling. We can win this battle. I can take you out of your pain and give you a legitimate way to exit this life. Because if we're talking about Islamic terrorism, you're not allowed to commit suicide. But if you're listening to a group like ISIS, Al-Shabaab, or Al-Qaeda, or maybe a Palestinian group, you are allowed to go on a suicide mission. And they don't call it suicide, they call it martyrdom. What about in non-conflict zones? I told you about this abortion clinic terrorist that tried to burn down 2 clinics. She wanted to stop what she saw as the murder of innocent children. And she had been trying to fight in legitimate political ways and felt that she was blocked, unheard, and finally decided to do this. Although she had been manipulated by handlers and recruiters that had played this whole thing out on her of, you're guilty if you do nothing. You're like the people in Germany that did nothing during the Holocaust. But in non-conflict zones, oftentimes it's smart people that are spending time on the internet, people that are angry over geopolitics. There's people that are searching for significance, the sense of who am I, identity, purpose, meaning, belonging. Some of them are uncomfortable with the sexual identity. We had, I think his name was Omar Mateen. He went into the Orlando disco and shot a lot of people. And that disco was known for gay patrons. And the whole clientele knew him. And but he was from Afghanistan. And in his culture, there's just no way that he could accept himself as homosexual. So in a way, he split off a part of himself and killed the others that were homosexuals, but and trying to do away with the part of himself that was unacceptable. So you see people that are searching for trying to consolidate a masculine identity. You also see women that maybe have been hurt in some ways and just want to go into a really traditional identity, be protected, hide their bodies, live under a niqab or a burqa. or if that is their Islamic identity already, are getting tired of being discriminated, spit upon, called names in the street. And then there's also the desire for adventure or romance. There's wanting to escape from problems at home. I remember talking to the Dutch police, and they said they had this girl that had been in a lot of different movements, and she ended up going into ISIS. She went all the way to Syria, and most of the people that went into ISIS crossed over the Turkish border. And when she did this, later she was back telling the police about it. She said, you know, as I ran across the border illegally, as I ran across the border, I just felt like my problems were going off of my shoulders. And I was leaving everything behind, and I was going into this, she didn't use this word, but into this utopia. And, you know, people that have a lot of problems, sometimes they just do anything to get away. And if a terrorist group is offering them an out, that's where they'll go. There's others that are angry about discrimination, marginalization, isolation, alienation, and here's a group that's willing to take them. So I think our time is going to be a little bit short, so I'm going to take advantage of screen share. And I think, you know, you can hear from me, but it's just theory. But to actually hear from the people themselves is really quite interesting, I think. So I'm going to show you 2 videos that we've made, and these are from our counter-narrative videos. And I'll be happy to talk to you about how we also fight against terrorism through counter-messaging on Facebook, Instagram, and some of the others, and how we've been working on rehabilitation and reintegration of people from ISIS. But I'm going to show you 2 short videos. They're each 4 or 5 minutes, and we'll show one after the other. But the first one I'm going to show, it's an Iraqi, and as you know, there was a real sectarian divide in Iraq, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda took advantage of it. So let's see that one first, and let me see, where are we here? Well, that's very strange. Oh, I see. Okay, just a second. I have to,
While Anne figures out how to share her videos, to all the participants who want to ask questions, you can put them in the chat. And once we see the videos and start question answer session, I'll take it up from the chat. Thank you.
that sounds good. Okay, yeah, I see how to do it now. Okay. You can hear it, right?
ناخذ الدولة الحكومة يعني شلون بأنه تصير حكومة سنية وبأنه كل من ياخذ حقه أنت تاخذ حقك من السوق من الأذان بأنه تصير دولة سنية وقالوا تسجنوني الأذون كنت معتقل بالسجن أنا في 2013 ديالة بلا فلوس فهو كانت عندنا مشكلة واعتقلوني عائلية يعني عشائرية شلون بين عشيرة وعشيرة فصار بيها دم واعتقلوني يعني عن طريق هذا الشر ولد اسمه زياد انتميت وياه من طلعت قال لي رقمك وجهه اعطيته رقم يطلع رقمي للتنظيم البري خابروني والتقى يصير انا بانه عن نفسي بانه انا اعتقلوني وانا شيء بريء وما عندي شيء بهاي السالفه السجن وتاذيت وتاذوا عائلتي بانه دفعوا محامي واصدقائي هم اللي كانوا وياي بهاي الشغله كلهم تنازلوا عنهم وطلعوهم بس انا ما تنازلوا بانه شيء يعني شيء سني او هم ذاك الشيء متنازلوا عليهم وطلعوا بس انا متنازلوا عنهم بانه اشتغلوا يوم بعد خمس ناس واحده على السيد احمد على الرؤوس واحده على اركان سعود الجوزي كانوا مصدر للقوات الامنيه بالباب مالته شخص العمر قالوا لهم بالعصر جاب السياره اللي خلته شخص ابو السلام منتسب للقوات الامنيه بالمنطقه داخل المنطقه بالباب مالته 5 منطقه حي العصر بالأدرس ديالة قالوا هذا بيت منطقة بالباب مالته العلاقية بس تحطها وتنسحب وتلينك على هذا المقام وتشوف التفكير كل يوم صار عليهم شيء فثاني يوم الصبح مدرعين بالخوف بأنه بتأخر حد ما شلون راح أتحاسب، ايش راح يصير علي، يعني أنا ايش راح يصير مصيري بأنه أنا قتلت هذا البشر. أخاف من الله، من الله عز وجل، من 5 تربية الطفل الخامس قبل يجي هذا. بس يعني ببالي بأنه الطفل هسه هذا شنو حاله، أنا ايش راح يصير حالي، الطفل قتل ولد، بس شيء ما أقدر عليه وأترجى بأنه يسامحني. متوقع بأنه يسامحني. هو الطفل هذا بريء، يعني ما يشعر، وانا يعني احس بنفسي بانه انا طبيت السجن شيء قتل هذا بالنوم مالتي وتعذب فيك، يلا اختنق مره اكبر ارقام، وقبل وقع بنفسي بانه اعتقلت شيء لان طلب هذا الطفل. بالبيت اعتقلوني اي بس اسمع صوت ما شفته، يعني تخيل وش حده وما نسوي شيء، شنو نسوي هو اعتقد كل شيء. انا صار سنتين يعني مو واجب ولا شايف، ما عندي لا رقم موبايل بانهم اخابرهم او اتصل عليهم يعني او يجوني على المدى يواجهوني. انتميت للتطبيق، انا بان تصير دوله سلميه وانا اثار نفسي، انتميت للتطبيق. صار العكس علي بانهم اعتقلوني، هاي طبقت للسجن، بهدلت وراحت حياتي اخرى بانهم قتلت طفل وذهب الى الجحيم. بس ادعو عز وجل ان يغفر لي ذنب اللي انا سويته. ما راح يعني ما سوى كل شيء بل إلى الأسوأ.
Okay, so that's one. And then I'd like to show you something completely different, which is from the far right in the US. Let's see. And I should tell you, since these are counter-narratives, we give them names that wouldn't give away that it's speaking against.
Mom lived in the heart of Flint, so we lived in a really, really bad neighborhood. Gangs, drive-by shootings. So I started hanging out with gangs. I started doing some drugs. But my mom's not home, and our stepfather didn't care about us, so I just would leave and go run the streets at night. So as soon as I was 18 years old, I deployed to Iraq for 18 months. Probably one of the worst deployments for a lot of different units. There's a lot of deaths. There's so many IED explosions going off all the time. It was definitely a tough time. I decided to come home, and when I did, it was hard to find a job anywhere. There was all kinds of different hate flags that were Confederate, Nazi flags, white nationalist flags. He had flags all up and down his driveway. And he had a swastika burnt into his grass, literally. Ron Chadwell, he was more of the Aryan Brotherhood in a lot of his beliefs. He talked really low, almost mysterious in a way. He was very, very charismatic at the way that he portrayed things. He played on my anger at the time. I was angry at the world. I was angry at what had happened to me as a child, my dad, the fact that my father wasn't in my life. I was angry at the fact that I felt like the Army kind of had abandoned me and didn't do anything for us. Black people aren't our friends. Look how white Europeans have flourished compared to Black communities. I started to believe it. He was under investigation. There was a guy that had joined their group, and they found out later on that he was a Jewish infiltrator. I don't know if he was working for the police, but when they found out who he was, they stabbed him to death and then drowned him. To me at the time, it was like, I felt like people were looking up to me. I had this little group. It really starts to feed into your ego. I think he was misunderstood, and that, yeah, he made some mistakes. That I didn't think he was a bad person. As much as I was sitting here and spitting this stuff out to people, deep down, I always had that gut feeling that what I was talking about was just wrong. Just didn't feel right. On the side, we were stealing boat motors. There was already gang task force that were already looking into us and keeping an eye on us. So when they came in, they raided us hard. They came in with AR-15s and pistols. They had my whole street blocked off. It was probably one of the craziest things I'd ever seen in my life. They found 2 of the 4-wheelers that we had stolen. They had me shook. And so I admitted to doing everything. And my uncle was pissed. I was scared. My first time ever being in jail. I didn't know what to do. I had this huge swastika tattoo on my arm. Next thing I know, I get jumped. And I'm getting hit from everywhere. And I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know how to protect myself except for just to cover myself up. But the guys that were part of these hate groups didn't come over to save me. But the one person that did come over to help me out was my cellmate at the time, a Black guy. So from there, we kind of started to build a relationship. He just kind of took me under his wing there for a while. You just need to learn. You need to sit down with some people and learn about some other cultures. I started to kind of reopen my eyes up to the fact that it didn't matter what color of skin you have. It don't matter where you come from. We all make mistakes. We all do stupid stuff, but we're human. Probably one of the hardest moments for me in my life, because one of them actually had me show them my tattoo at the time. I hadn't had it covered up yet. I bawled my eyes out. I bawled my eyes out, and it was a deep moment for me in my life. Understand that a lot of these guys have learned psychologically how to talk to you the right ways and try to make you feel comfortable as a friend, but they're not your friends. If somebody tells you something, go out and research it. Go ask somebody else to talk to you about it. What they're teaching you is just propaganda, and it's just to feed their own egos. At the end of the day, that's really all it was, I think. To Ron, was just his ego. Now, he got murdered. Having that peace in your heart and love first is going to make you feel so much better at the end of the day than to hold on to hate and anger, because it will eat you up. It tears you up inside, internally, physically.
So that gives you an idea of some of the interviews that I've done over the years, and how we work with the material that we collect. We write a lot about from the data and try to analyze it, and also you learn from each study, each person. And so let me see, you've got some questions here. Oh, they're definitely motivated by seeking justice, but part of seeking justice is sometimes, in some people's minds, enacting revenge. Let's see.
And I can read out the questions just in case people who are not able to read the chat.
Sure.
They can know. Thanks. So we have Dr. Mike Gauss. He's saying, aren't they motivated by seeking justice? He's talking about terrorists. Aren't terrorists motivated by seeking justice rather than revenge?
That's the one I just answered.
Yeah. We have Rauf M asking, hi Anne, would it be fair to say that terrorism stems from injustices faced by helpless human beings who did not have legitimate channels to access justice and vent their frustration of helplessness and humiliation they faced?
Well, in some cases that's true, and in other cases there's open political channels, but the terrorist groups convince people that it's faster or better to use violence. So, we've got tons of Europeans that joined ISIS, and we have some Americans, and, certainly you can vote, you can talk to your congressman, you can do all kinds of things, but they chose to take a different route. And you see the motivations there. Some people believing that they were going to a utopia, and just putting it out of their mind, all the negative things that ISIS was doing, or saying that these negative things were necessary to create the utopia. So it's not always true that they don't have access to justice, but it is true some of the time, for sure. And it's definitely true when you see despotic regimes and things like that. And the abortion clinic terrorist that I told you about had tried a lot of political things, and she tried peaceful marching and things like that in protest. But then a terrorist recruiter got a hold of her and started manipulating her mind and telling her that she should use violence, and that she should join what was called the Army of God, people that used violence against abortion clinics and abortion doctors.
As a last resort, maybe that's how people can be manipulated, that they have no hope left anywhere?
Well, they can be manipulated to believe that the channels that they should be using don't work, or that it's just so horrible that you should instead move to violence.
Okay. We have Ali Khan he's making a statement, and I think asking as well, we cannot deny Muslims are not being harmed. Islamophobia does exist. Nobody likes to be a terrorist. You did mention circumstances lead them to laws. to allow for self-defense, but Palestinians are harmed, occupied, but they cannot defend. And if they defend, they are called terrorists. So we have the federal definition, Code of Federal Regulations definition that defines terrorism as unlawful use of force and violence against persons. So he just defines it, and what he's saying is,
No, I understand the question. I get it.
yeah.
When I went through Palestinian territories, what I was told is the Israelis have American weapons, they have the Apache, and all we have is our bodies. So we strap on bombs and we go and kill ourselves to fight back. Maybe you could accept that if they just go to military checkpoints. Then it's one military against the other and extremely dedicated people that are willing to die. But that's where you oftentimes hear one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And I just totally disagree with that. And it depends which definition of terrorism you're using. If you use a general definition like this one, and there's 500 definitions of terrorism, and the UN cannot agree on any definition of terrorism, but my definition of terrorism is that you intentionally target and kill civilians. And you may do all these other things as well, but you do it for a political objective, and you do it to create terror in the hearts of your enemy population. So somebody that goes into a pizzeria and blows up mothers and children, for me, you're just never going to say that's a freedom fighter. You know, you can go and blow up a bus of soldiers if you're having a fight with their military. Then maybe you can be called an insurgent or a freedom fighter, but not when you go and intentionally attack civilians. So that's what I would have to say about that. But, you know, there's, you know, entire debates and books written on those things, and you know, that's my answer, but people have different answers.
We have another question.
I just add to Anne's comment on that. I think those of us who work in the area of nonviolence, take a very firm stance on this definition of that no violence can ever be justified or be legitimized. So, you know, I would really caution on the kind of thinking that creates excuses or as explanations for the use of violence, especially, as Anne said, against civilians and people who have nothing, you know, who are not in the middle of that conflict. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you. Thank you, Shirley.
Yeah, very well said, yes. Another question from Dilip. I'm sorry, I'm not saying your last name. I don't know how to pronounce it. You mentioned that religious literature is used to sell the psychological weak and stressed on the terrorist cause. What can be done to address this?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Thank you for that question. I think that there's a number of things that we should think about. First of all, anybody that's new to a religion can be confused by it. You know, so with groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, they love to get a hold of converts, because someone that's converted into Islam, maybe from Christianity, might be rejected from their own family, so they're isolated. And if they're brought into a new group, they're really grateful for the belonging, and they're also don't know that much. So you can start teaching them about martyrdom, and a Muslim that's well educated about their religion would say, wait a minute, I don't think that's the real definition of martyrdom, if they're teaching about suicide terrorism. And same thing with the abortion clinic terrorists that were using Christian and Old Testament scriptures to say that, you know, God was aware of you as you were formed in the womb, and the people that kill children should be killed, and, you know, things like this. What I think we should do is, with all these ideologies that are out there these days, and far-right ideologies as well, we know that our youth are probably going to be exposed to them. And I've talked to lots of Muslims that say, you know, my kid's 12 and I get scared when they're on the internet. You know, you don't know what they're gonna like fall into, and it's so horrible. And so my view is right around 12 years old, you know, when you usually would take a civics class, they should have a section in the civics class that introduces you to these ideologies and tells you this is what the ideology teaches, and this is why it's wrong, and this is why this one's not even Islamic, and this one is manipulating Christian scriptures, and this one is, you know, whatever, and make them understand in a really cognitive way where the loopholes are and where the jump is over logic, because when they encounter it in an emotionally evocative situation, they won't be able to think clearly. And this is what terrorist groups are really good at. So right now we see the far right being instigated against Black Lives Matter. And when you see all this looting and you see people out on the streets and creating bonfires in the streets, and if you take that footage and you play with it and you say, you know, this is why we have to make America great again or white again or whatever, you know, it happens to be, you can use all that violence to justify your stance, and you can start to sell an ideology with pictures. But then if you start weaving religion into it on top of it, and you already believe those religious things, those are tenets of your faith, they're maybe the most important parts of your faith, and if you weave that in, you can't think anymore and you just accept it. So I think if we do a inoculation ahead of time in a calm setting, where there's not emotionally evocative pictures of victims being shown or some injustice or something that's wrong, and just say, this is what these terrorist groups say, and, you know, let's look at it logically. Is this correct? And of course it's not. So we can do inoculations. The other thing is we can ask people from that religious group to speak against it. But I will say this has been a problem with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS, with Al-Shabaab, that religious leaders sometimes don't want to speak out because the grievances that the groups are speaking about are real. So if there's, you know, Muslims in so many countries that are being oppressed or that are living under dictators, the religious leaders don't want to downplay that and say that's not true, because it is true. So they don't feel comfortable saying the message of that the terrorist groups are wrong, or they're afraid of the terrorist groups. And in Iraq, we've seen all kinds of people that spoke out against ISIS, including religious leaders, killed. So we would hope that they would speak out against it and say that that's not true, that it's not a true interpretation of the religion. So let's go to the next question.
Right. We have 5 minutes to 8 left, but we started a bit late, so maybe we can go 5 minutes over, if that's okay with you, Anne? Yeah, okay. Next question is from Porus Tadabai. How do we prevent terrorism? As citizens, how do we indulge in counterterrorism?
Well, it's really nice to speak to a group like yours that's promoting peace and conflict resolution. But, you know, by being peaceful and loving in our lives and seeing where there are real grievances and trying to address them, and anytime we do anything to promote justice and for people's voices to be heard. You know, sometimes people just want to be heard and they want to be respected and they want to be treated with dignity. So there's so much we can do, and you know, working for equality in our political process and our societies, and appreciating diversity.
Very, very good pointers, Anne. We have Sunita Vishwanath. She is a co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights, which is doing an incredible job. She says, thanks for an incredibly interesting talk and for your important work. Have you seen major differences between different kinds of terrorism? Are there characteristics unique to Hindutva terrorism?
I have not studied Hindutva terrorism, but I did have a very interesting talk with a psychiatrist from India that had been a victim of this terrorism. And she was completely terrified by what had happened to her and her family. She said that at the time that they were hiding in their house, cowering in their basement because people were being killed. And she would be sent out to get the food because she could pass. She looked Hindu and she was young. But that she was completely terrified if somebody figured out who she was, that she'd be killed. And this left a scar on her for life. But that honestly is my only experience that I know about this kind of terrorism. But I think that what we find is that it's similar across the board, that people get convinced, well, their fears get played upon, and their fears and their ignorance get manipulated into hate and into violence.
And we do see a lot of confirmation bias when you go on the internet and you want to do your research. Like in the video you played, and the man said, well, when you hear something, go out and do your research. But then you research and you just find the first thing that agrees with your point of view, you agree with that.
Yeah.
So confirmation bias plays a whole big role in it. We have Jim Howland. He says, if the suicide bomber acts out of desperation at the futility of the situation he faces, and has no political goal, no expectation that his act will change the behavior of those he views as oppressors, does his act qualify as terrorism?
Yes, because he's not acting alone. He's acting with a group. And what I found when I studied Palestinian suicide terrorists is that some of them did understand that it wasn't going to change the balance of things, and that the Israelis still had the upper hand. And honestly, they just wanted the other side to feel their pain, and they wanted to exit this life. So on an individual level, it was an act of despair. It was true suicide, even though they hoped that they were going to the afterlife as a glorious martyr. And but the group wanted to spread terror, or the group wanted to revenge, and the group was definitely acting with a political goal in mind. So yes, it's terrorism, but you have to ask yourself from both points of view, from the individual's point of view and from the group's point of view.
That's very interesting, yes. We have Shastri Swaminathan saying, our Homeland Security reported that white supremacist groups are the #1 threat to our national security. How do we deal with this when our national leaders encourage them?
We do exactly what we just did, and we vote them out of office.
True, that was, I think, a solace we all have right now. We have Ketan Patwardhan. He's asking, would you term Army or Defense Force as terrorist?
There are a lot of similarities between war crimes and terrorism, but these are definitional things. So terrorists are non-state actors by most definitions, although many terrorists receive state support. So, we know that Saddam Hussein was supporting terrorists. We know Iran supported terrorists. We supported terrorists when we were helping the precursors of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan against the Russians. Or at least we helped insurgents. But they are two different entities. And I've been asked many times by terrorists, how can you call me a terrorist when your military does collateral damage and kills all these people in a drone strike or this or that? And what I always say to that is, I understand what you're saying, but there is a fundamental difference between someone who intentionally goes to kill women and children versus somebody that goes to kill a terrorist that's a known terrorist and accidentally or knowingly kills the people that he's kept close around him. And in some ways, there's some blame to him for keeping his family and other people close to him when he's engaging in terrorist acts. But the collateral damage argument is a really strong one and a legitimate one that terrorists have against our military acts. And they're not only military, CIA acts. So it's something to think about. And do we have an ideology? Yes. And do we other? Yes. Like our military, when we were in Iraq, a lot of them referred to Muslims as ragheads or diaper heads. And I know I lived in Belgium for 7 years, and there were a lot of military that were then later posted to NATO. And when they would hear Arabic, or they would be out in the community and hear Moroccan Belgians talking or see them, they would have a visceral reaction because they'd been taught this is the enemy, the Arab Muslim. And, you know, that's concerning for sure.
We have a very interesting question here. Can we call capitalistic interests and infringement into others' lands by rich and powerful nations as a form of terrorism as well? Do you think addressing such kind of terrorism bring about some peace to the world?
I would call it predatory corporations and injustice. And yes, anytime that we address injustice in the world, and when wealth is shared in a more equal way, and I'm not saying, you know, in a communistic way, but just, you know, that there's some fairness to it, we'll see less terrorism, because there won't be the grievances that the terrorists can play upon to recruit people into their groups. But I don't think that predatory corporate and capitalistic interests would fall under most definitions of terrorism. But I do get the point. And injustice is a really important thing to address. And I'm really glad to meet all of you, because it sounds to me like that's what you're working on, and working on promoting nonviolent answers, and that's wonderful. I'm really glad to support you.
Thank you. Stephanie Hughes is asking, are some terrorists capable of participating in win-win-win negotiation among all stakeholders to see solutions that meet the basic needs of all?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I've sat and talked with terrorist ideologues and propagandists, and some of them are really smart, and they're smart and angry. They're just angry over injustice, and you know, their blood is boiling for what they've seen. But I think if they really believed that they can move the political process in another way, they would consider it. I remember talking to Ahmed Sadat in prison he was in prison in Jericho, and I asked him, why didn't you ever try any nonviolent things? And he told me we did. And we had a long talk about possibilities of nonviolent political protests to win some of the rights that they wanted. But he said it always devolved into some kind of violence, and that they couldn't control it. So yeah, I think that there are many terrorist leaders that they care very much about their people, and they would prefer not to be using terrorist violence, but they don't see other options.
And the second part of her question was, I think you partly kind of spoke about it. Will the above satisfy the terrorist and motivate him to stop terrorizing?
Well, I think we have to say that these are really politically savvy people, and they're people that have engaged and are willing to engage in more violence. So, you know, when you ask, are they willing to see the rights and needs of all people? Probably not. You know, I think that they would engage in political talks. I think that they would solve things in a political way. But are they good actors? No. I mean, they're probably like all politicians. You know, they're not necessarily looking out for everybody. They're looking out for their group.
I'm just going to put this question by Ketan. He already asked one question before, and I think it's more or less, he's talking about CIA, but when you spoke about army as terrorism, or bringing economic disability by powerful corporations in another country, on the same lines, I would say this would answer this question. Would you treat CIA as a terrorist organization? So,
no, I mean, that's not a non-state actor. But, you know, does the CIA engage in crimes? I mean, there's been this whole debate over, should the CIA be organizing and ordering drone attacks, because that's the action of a military according to international law. And I think that they cut back on a lot of the CIA drone attacks exactly because of
that. This is the last question I'm putting up. It is again by Sunita, and we'll be wrapping up after this question. What are your thoughts about the Taliban poised maybe to become a legitimate entity, perhaps even part of or all of the government in Afghanistan?
I'm not much of a scholar on the Taliban, so I don't know, but I can say we have seen terrorist groups, we've seen 2 terrorist leaders win Nobel Prizes. And we've seen terrorist groups transition into having political parties and winning seats in parliament, and Hezbollah is an example of that. So if Taliban wants to be part of the political process and play by the rules, that's wonderful. That's great. But then they've got to give up armed conflict.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and to that point, if I can add, in India, there are terrorists, people who are not only in parliament, but chief minister of a state. They openly incite terrorism. So that happens in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm.
Shalini, I totally agree with you. But before we leave, if you want me to read the list of concerns that is by the current government and the Prime Minister, especially Prime Minister Modi, that is a little bit horrendous.
Yeah,
and it is a long list.
This is not
and
the right, excuse
right
me
platform
for jumping
right
in. This is not the right platform
some
for
other
that.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Thank you. Yeah, we had a lot of interest by a lot of people, and when we let people know we are doing this webinar, and you can see there's a whole lot of interest that was generated, and people have so many ideas, and thank you for answering so many relevant questions. It is sometimes on borderline of ethics and morality that we can say there is something wrong with it, but what exactly is wrong with violence, or this kind of violence, or that kind of violence? Army does it too. Why are the terrorists blamed, not the army? So many relevant points. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I'm sure all of us are leaving this webinar much more educated, and definitely we are going to use all the pointers that we learned from you today.
Great.
And thank you everybody for joining.
I put my email in the chat, and if you write to me, I'll put you on our mailing list. And really nice to meet all of you. Keep up your
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I want to thank, on behalf of United for Peace, I want to thank Porus Dadaboy for connecting with you and for bringing you on as a speaker for tonight's session.
Okay.
And we hope to have further interaction. This is a very important topic, not only across the world, but for the United States. We've seen a lot of growth in terrorism and hate activities in the last few years. So it's a very relevant topic, and your talk has been very informative. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. Good night. Have a nice
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.